really made it. And the simple concept is that you cannot have economic efficiency if it is consistently being undermined by social inequity, social injustice, social marginalization. Similarly, you cannot have a growing and effective economy if the resource base on which that economy depends is being undermined. And therefore, if you want an economy that is going to continue to support human society over the long term, then you have to ensure that you eliminate those forms of economic organization that really undermine the social basis and the environmental basis for development. Now, I picked the economy as the central pillar. Others would pick society as the central pillar or the environment as the central pillar. It doesn't actually really matter. What counts is that if you have economic efficiency up here that's operating in a way that leads to social exclusion, to marginalization, to mass immigration, you are actually undermining what you're trying to achieve up here. And if you have an economy that is pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere in such a way that is leading us to the edge of the cliff, you don't have the means of achieving what you want to achieve up here. So sustainable development means not only looking at the overlap between the two, but looking at the overlap between the three. We have to locate our development, our economic activity, our future in that space. And that's essentially what sustainable development is about. The effort to bring about sustainable development is the effort to curb unsustainable practices, to bring them from where they are now, either way out here or in an area of partial overlap, down towards the center in every case. So if you think about it, sustainable development is a genuinely good idea. Why would you want a form of development that undermines the environment on which it's based, that leads to more and more destruction of resources, that leads to the undermining of the basis for human existence? Nobody in their right minds would want that. And similarly, why would you want the form of economic development that leads to massive loss of jobs, massive marginalization of people, a real cleavage within society that has the roots of future conflict? Nobody in their right minds would want that. So sustainable development is actually a really good idea. And I would say more than that. Sustainable development is the only acceptable alternative for humanity. There are lots of alternatives for humanity, but it's the only acceptable one, because all of the others involve some kind of calamity happening. Now, I could do this whole lecture by talking about the social consequences of unsustainable development. But my background is mainly in the environment, and so I'm going to focus more on the environmental pillar. And I think the first thing that it's important to say is that, you know, sustainable development hasn't been a failure. There's been a lot of progress in sustainable development. When you think that the environment was a very marginal concept a couple decades ago, and now it's absolutely central. If you look at the priorities, the stated priorities of governments, if you look at their electoral platforms, if you look at what they are stating in public events like the World Economic Forum in Davos, you'll hear a lot of talk about how they are committed to a stable environment. They're committed to achieving sustainable development. If you look at what's happened in the corporate world, in the private sector, corporations are picking up this notion of sustainability and trying to demonstrate not only that they are good corporate citizens, but that they understand that the future of their own corporate activity actually depends on understanding and building sustainability into their practices. If you look around the world, there has been an enormous development of environmental laws, international environmental conventions and treaties, environmental agencies, environmental ministries. There's been a boom of all of these things. And this shows that this is a concept that people understand and have picked up and want to succeed with. And if you look at the public opinion polls routinely throughout Western countries, throughout developed countries, and increasingly in the case of developing countries, you will see that environment rates high. It very often rates at the top. So people have a real concern for the environment. They have a real concern for the future of our planet, for the future of our country, for the future of our families and societies. And they want the government to respond to it. So all of this is a result of 20 years of pretty solid activity. We have a lot that I think we can be proud of. Now, how do you judge whether that progress is enough, whether it's really been satisfactory? Well, Oren Young, what happened to that slide? Okay, it's suddenly gone. Oren Young was at the University of California at Santa Barbara and is a bit of a guru on environmental governance. Says that if you want to judge the adequacy of the environmental measures, you have to ask yourself whether the response is proportionate to the dimensions of the problem, and whether the response is keeping pace with the way that the problem develops. If the response is well thought through, but not proportionate to the dimensions of the problem will continue to grow. And if you have a response that's adequate at one point, but the problem continues to develop, you actually don't have a solution that's going to work in the longer term. The problem is simply going to get bigger. So if you ask ourselves, how are we doing putting these criteria, judging our progress by applying these criteria, what do we find? Well, as Richard said in his opening, in a lot of areas, the news is actually very bad. I said I'd only give you one slide on the bad news, and this is it. The news is very bad. And we are facing something now which is unique. We have never faced before. We have had economic crises in the past. We've had a cycle of them. We've had the Great Depression. We've had lots of downturns in the economy that have worried people very considerably. And we have had a growing set of environmental problems that are manifesting themselves ever more, that people understand and are worried about more every year. But what we are facing today is what the Australian writer Paul Gilding calls the Great Disruption. And that is a coincidence, a confluence of a major economic crisis and the unfolding of a series of social and economic crises that suggests that we are reaching the point where we're in danger of a real breakdown in our systems. So this is not yet another crisis. It's not yet just another step up in the dimensions of the problems that we're dealing with. This is actually a new situation. You all are probably sick to death about talking about climate change, but the most responsible science tells us that we have a limited window in which to take real action to reduce atmospheric carbon and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And if we don't take advantage of that window, if we don't act within that time frame, there is a serious risk that we will trigger events that are then irreversible, what they call the scenario of catastrophic climate change. We're not there yet, but we're edging towards it fairly quickly, and the window that's left for us to act is very small. Now, climate change is very well known. Everybody's been talking about it for the past few years. Everybody's been pinning their hopes on the Copenhagen conference that we had in December last year. Everybody's urging their governments to take solid action, and people are more and more frightened about the prospects of climate change. But it's by far not the only problem that we face. There was a few years ago a very impressive report done called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which looked in the way that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change looks at climate change. It looks at biodiversity, the richness, the diversity of species on Earth, which is the foundation for the resilience of our systems. And it came to the conclusion that the risks and the dangers and the pace of degradation in the area of biodiversity was every bit as worrying as the prospect of catastrophic climate change. That if we don't do something to reduce and stop and finally reverse the loss of biodiversity, we could be facing a crisis that's every bit as important in its dimensions as the crisis of climate change. This is the International Year of Biodiversity. How many of you knew that? How many of you are linked in to the sorts of actions that people are trying to take to bring biodiversity onto the radar screen, to get people to pay attention to it? You know, probably very few of you, and that would be true in any country where I gave this talk. We can look at any number of areas. You know, the world's fisheries. If you look at the 14 major fisheries in the world, 12 of them are at or near the state of collapse. In other words, fish stocks and fish catch rises, and then it plummets, and it stays down there. And that's now happened in 12 out of the 14 major fisheries around the world. This is a crisis, and even if you take off the pressure, the experience is that they don't build back. Richard mentioned water. There's increasing competition for water. There's increasing concern that climate change is going to lead to severe water stress. And we start seeing things that are happening. I'm just going to talk about land grabs. We're seeing countries investing billions of dollars into agricultural land, buying agricultural land in the developing countries. Why are they doing that? Why are they doing that instead of investing in agricultural development? You have Saudi Arabia buying large parts of Sudan. You have the Emirates buying large parts of Pakistan, supposedly to grow crops. They're desert countries, they need food, and this is an investment in their food security. But if you look closely, what they're actually trying to do is to tie up water rights. So these contracts give them access to land, but they also guarantee them access to water. And the reason that these contracts, in our view, are being developed is that they can see forward, they can see the problems of water stress, they can see the fact that there's going to be increasing competition for the ever more limited water resources, and they want to make sure that they've got it tied up. We see an increase in conflict around resources. All over the developing world, we see an increase in the sorts of conflict between groups who want to gain access to resources, or between groups who once had access to resources and are finding those access limited. The losers in those conflicts become environmental refugees. There's an enormous movement. If you know something about the refugee world, you will know that about approximately a quarter of all the world's refugees can be considered environmental refugees, and that proportion is growing steadily. So not only are there problems with conflict locally, but it creates reverberations as these people move out, move into other people's land, and start competing for what's left. And of course, it leads to an enormous increase in illegal immigration. A lot of the people floating across the Mediterranean and landing in Italy or in Greece are people who once had livelihoods in the rural areas and have lost those livelihoods as a result of environmental degradation. And if you look at, if you look sort of below the carpet at these things that aren't talked about very much, you'll realize that trade, illegal trade, which is trade in substances that should not be traded, or in arms or in drugs or whatever, where the trade itself is illegal, or illicit trade, where you're trading in goods that could be traded legally, but the trade is being undertaken in a way that's not legal. That is the fastest growing form of trade in the world. We're talking about trillions of dollars going to that sort of trade. So we have a crisis, which is not only an economic crisis, but it's an addition of an economic crisis and an environmental crisis that's leading to very, very significant social consequences and pressures on our societies. So if you look on the one hand at what we have achieved in 25 years, and on the other hand at the continuing problems and the fact that those problems continue to get worse, we have a situation that was described brilliantly by Gus Speth, who was until recently the dean of the Yale School of Forestry and the Environment. He says that for all of our success, we've been walking north on a southbound train. We had the impression that we're making progress. We have the impression that we're moving in the right direction. But if you step back and widen your perspective, you realize that that progress has been on a platform that's actually moving backwards. Now, I look back at 20 or 30 years of work in this field, and I ask myself, what did we do wrong? Sustainable development, I insist, is a really good idea. And in fact, I challenge anybody to come up with a concept for humanity that is better than that and that could work. So given the fact that it's such a good idea, what did we do wrong? And I think we started with a bunch of, we started with a series of assumptions that I think were quite wrong. I mean, we felt that if you presented sustainable development, everybody would embrace it. After all, why would you want the form of development that undermines the environment? Why would you promote a form of development that promotes social exclusion? Why would you want to do that? So we thought, people are going to pick this up. And then we realized that wasn't happening. We thought, well, maybe the fact is we're not providing accurate information. We're not providing the facts on this stuff. That the concept is fine, but we're not supplementing it with the facts, with the knowledge that you need to move towards sustainable development. We felt that maybe if we did that, we'd trigger an adequate response from society. That didn't work either. So we thought, well, maybe they just don't know how to do it, how to move from present unsustainable practices to sustainable practices. And we thought if we showed the way, if we developed some examples, that here are some of the things you might do. And that didn't work either. And probably one of the most fundamental mistakes we made was to think that, so these are environment problems, and we need environmental responses to those problems. And very often, the truth is that the environmental problems are caused by poor social policy or poor economic policy, and that as environmentalists, we were trying to respond with the wrong tools to a problem. And finally, we thought that, well, we're still not moving towards sustainable development. The unsustainability of our present development is beginning to cause serious problems. Maybe we could frighten people into taking the action that's needed. We're going off the cliff with climate change. We're losing our fisheries. Our water's going to disappear. Our glaciers are all going to melt. Let's get these people really frightened. You've got kids. You've got a future. You should be scared of this thing. And we found that that didn't work either. So when I say that, when I pose the question, why did such a good idea not actually function? I think it's, first of all, because we based it on a bunch of serious mistaken assumptions. And what I want to do in the next part is to take you through 3 examples from my own experience, from my own work in the field in the developing world, of the sorts of approaches we took and what we discovered by trying to work with them. The first one concerns a cloud forest national park in Honduras called La Tigra. And I want to use this as an example of how narrow approaches to conservation miss the point. I don't know how many of you have ever been in a cloud forest, but it's a rare and very rapidly disappearing ecosystem. They tend to be hilltop forests that capture the passing clouds and capture the passing humidity and remain in a state of fog and cloud virtually all the time. This particular one had very high amenity value because it's about 8 miles from the capital of Honduras, from Tegucigalpa. So it's a place that actually had real value because it's a kind of a green lung for the capital city, a place where people can go. But the other thing about it is that it's the second most important source of drinking water for the capital. And when you think about it, as a source of drinking water, it has fantastic advantages. You can think of a cloud forest as a kind of well in reverse. It pumps the humidity from the atmosphere and brings it down to the ground. Or you can think of it as what they call a dam without structures. Here you have a source of water that doesn't require huge engineering works. And we thought we could play with those two things. If we want to conserve the cloud forest, we can sell it on the basis of its economic value as a source of drinking water. And the arguments just seem to be perfect. You know, the water that came out of La Tigra is I think 12 times cheaper than the water from that, which is the principal source of drinking water for Tegucigalpa, the La Fortuna Dam. But we went further in our economic calculations. We said, what happens if that forest is just knocked down, if it just disappears? Where will Tegucigalpa get its water from? And we calculated that replacing that water would be 28 times as expensive as maintaining the cloud forest. I thought, well, we already have a protected area status, so everything is in place to preserve it. But we also realized that the pressures on the ecosystems were growing. I mean, Tegucigalpa already faced a pretty serious water shortage. In the dry season, families would have to buy water from tanker trucks or from people like this, and they were spending up to 40% of family income buying poor quality water and depriving the family of the funds they needed for health and education. And in the years before we started this project, there have been serious riots as a result of the water situation in Tegucigalpa. So here you have a cloud forest that is a source of cheap and clean water, should be preserved, and yet the situation was not nearly that easy. Because what happened, we realized, is that you have the cloud forest here, the darker green, but all around in the buffer zone, you had people moving in illegally. And what they were doing is planting, cultivating, clearing the vegetation here, and moving into the park to cut firewood. So slowly, this whole cloud forest was being eaten away from the outside. And we talked to these people and said, you know, why don't you terrace your land? This is steep land, and every year when it rained, the soil would flow away. Why don't you terrace your land? And why don't you plant trees on part of your land to give yourselves a regular source of income? And the answer we got was that these people had no clear tenure on their land. They moved in there, they were occupying it, but they didn't own it. Now this land was very close to Tegucigalpa, and therefore potentially quite attractive land. And they said that if you invest in terracing, if you invest in planting trees, these are investments that are realized over a period of years. And they had no idea whether they would be there next year or even 6 months from now. So what you have is a call for investment without security. And investment would make the land more attractive for people who had more political power and therefore could take the land away from them. So what we realized was that the environmental degradation that you saw in that area, which was threatening the cloud forest, is actually a survival strategy for these people. They needed to make their land as unattractive as possible for people who had more power to them than they did, in order to ensure that they could stay on that land and continue to farm. So here we started off with saying, well, this is beautiful cloud forest. It's the home of the ocelot and the quetzal and other wonderful things, and it's full of biodiversity. Let's put a fence around it and put some signs up and hope people won't abuse it. And we came from that to a situation where we realized that the future of this cloud forest actually lies in what happens around the park. And that if you want to preserve the environmental values, you cannot do it unless you're addressing the social ones. And that if you don't address both the social and environmental needs, then you are threatening a serious economic problem represented by the loss of drinking water for the capital and a further undermining of the social situation. So that was a real shift. I mean, starting from the need to conserve and moving on to the need to do something about land tenure for poor people outside the park. So we started with thinking there are environmental solutions to this and ended up thinking, well, no, actually the solutions are outside. I don't know how many of you know the Serengeti ecosystem in Tanzania. It's about 8 times the size of Orange County. It has 2 million of these wildebeest. It's got 200,000 zebras. It's the Garden of Eden. It's the most extraordinary place I've ever been to on Earth. It's this huge, empty, beautiful landscape swarming with wild animals. Nobody living there. It is an absolutely amazing place. We started working to try and find to try and design a strategy for the Serengeti ecosystems. This has been an effort since 1958 to save this ecosystem. Serengeti has become a major source of tourist income for the Tanzanian government. And since Serengeti borders on Masai Mara and Kenya, part of the same ecosystem, Tanzania has actually really benefited from the spillover from Kenyan tourism. That's the Kenya border there. This is the Serengeti Park, as I said, 8 times the size of Orange County. And then there's a special wildlife area here, and then partial use reserves on either side. The Serengeti has attracted a huge amount of investment in tourism infrastructure, in maintenance, but all the districts around it have been very badly neglected. So that what you have over time is a spectacle of extraordinary natural richness within the borders and increasing poverty and deprivation outside the borders. And it's perfectly clear, I think, that you cannot expect a sustainable future for Serengeti if it remains high and everything else remains low and continues to sink, because you'll reach a point where there isn't an army in the world that can keep those people from moving in and trying to benefit from the resources that are there in Serengeti. What do we find? Instead, that land is sold illegally to rich investors from the Gulf who set up hunting camps. You have the Maasai villagers who live in the area, who are facing this dilemma that they're okay as long as they remain sort of tourist curiosities and live the way their ancestors did 200 years ago. But if they try and improve the standard of living, of health, of education, of infrastructure, then they're accused of taking actions that are incompatible with conservation. And it became perfectly clear to us that there was no future for this place unless you could design a solution that worked both inside and outside the park. So once again, this focus on conservation convinced us that conservation can only work if you bring sustainability to the communities surrounding the park. And one other very quick example I'll give you from the inner delta of the Niger River. The Niger River starts in the Fouta-Jalon mountains in Guinea, flows up through Mali, and then down through Niger and Nigeria to the Niger Delta, which is the oil production area of Nigeria. But the inner delta is quite exceptional because when the water comes here, it opens up and floods a very large area and then collects again into a single river on the other side and flows on. So you've got this vast ecosystem. And it goes through an annual cycle where during the rains, the whole area turns into a large, shallow inland lake. And then the water recedes and gets almost dry again, and then the cycle starts again. There's been an extraordinary adaptation there, and that is that there are 3 tribes that live there. One is a fishing tribe, another is a planting tribe, and the third is a herding tribe. So when the floods come, the fishermen move in and they feed the others. And as the water recedes, the planting tribe plants their crops at the edge of the receding water and harvests them at the end. And when it dries out and the crops have been harvested, the herders come in and their cattle eat the crop stubble, break up the hard mud flats, and then the floods come again. So there's been a kind of unwritten understanding among these three that they help each other out. But then, the drought came to the Sahel. Climate change is beginning to lead to loss of reliable floods. So the whole system began to break down. And then they started building dams in the upper part of the Niger River, which interrupted the flow. And so we went in there and thought, well, we need to renegotiate this deal. They had this beautiful balanced accord that was working and began to break down. The Sahel drought brought new people into the area that weren't part of it. They started abusing the resources. And what we observed is that we had people cutting trees and being fined by the forest guards and the wildlife guards. They were poaching, they were hunting. And we realized that you don't have a sustainable situation where the government people are simply repressing the locals. You need to get them to work together to find sustainable solutions. And we promoted that. We wanted to convert the forest guards to rural policemen. From being rural policemen to being rural extensionists, to working with the villages to find sustainable solutions. And we found that it didn't work, that they continued to just fine and repress these people. And we finally figured out why. And that is that this place is very remote from the capital. And these guards have been told, we're not going to pay you a salary, you have to earn your income through fines. So a simple government policy mechanism, the fact of forcing these people to earn their income by fining the local population, made it impossible to advance towards the solution that we were trying to promote. So those three examples from my own direct experience are designed to show that you have an environmental problem, you can understand it very well, but the solution to the environmental problem may actually not lie within the field of the environment. So come up with some tentative conclusions, which I'll revise later. You have a situation where environmental action worldwide tends to focus more on the symptoms than on the causes of the problem. Environmental problems organizations, because they understand the environment, they understand ecology, they understand biology, they tend to try and focus on that because that's their area of strength. And even if the solution to the problem doesn't lie through biology, there's a strong inclination to say, well, we'll deal with the biological side of it and hope that the rest falls in place. You have examples from my own experience, and I worked for both of these organizations, WWF and IUCN. Those are both organizations dedicated to biodiversity conservation. Now, if you're dedicated to biodiversity conservation, surely you should ask yourself, what is leading to biodiversity loss? Why isn't biodiversity being conserved? And draw up a list of the top 10 factors. Maybe it's land tenure, maybe it's bad laws, maybe it's poor policy, maybe it's economic incentives. And if you're really devoted to biodiversity conservation, surely you should be focused on those things that are most important in terms of biodiversity loss. Neither of these organizations is doing that, because the principal reasons for biodiversity loss are bad economic policy. And they don't understand economic policy, they do biology. So there's a real dilemma in this. Now, historian Tony Yuta has said, maybe imperfect improvements on unsatisfactory circumstances are the best that we can hope for, and probably all that we should seek. I think that if we accept that, then we're never going to get to sustainability, and I would fear for the future of humanity. But I think that there's more. So in the remaining part of this talk, I want to talk about how you actually take our understanding of the environment and the dangers of environmental degradation into the economic policy space, into the economic policy arena, and start to change that economic policy so that it is supportive of sustainable development. We have, if you look at this from the ecological footprint report, what you have is a situation where we are currently consuming at a rate that would require 1.5 planets to sustain. In other words, if we had 1.5 planets worth of resources, we could sustain the present level of consumption. And a sort of business as usual scenario would take us quickly up to 2 planets worth of consumption by 2040, 2050. So the challenge for us is how you can change that trend, bring this line down to here and get to the point where a single planet is supporting the population of that same planet. That's the challenge. And what we have been trying to do is to take environmental action that will pull this line down. And we have been successful. Without it, the line would probably be up here. But as you can see, we're not only far from a sustainable form of consumption, we're getting farther away from it under our business as usual scenario. So what is it that could narrow that gap and finally close it? I think we need to reboot the concept of sustainable development. I think that our experience has shown that we have been, in a sense, delivering the wrong message in the wrong language to the wrong audience. When we speak of biodiversity, our politicians are talking about employment. When we speak of soil degradation, they're talking about security. And in a sense, we have to bring our message in the right language to the right audience. It's no use talking to environment ministers. They don't have the authority or the mandate to make the change that's needed. The graph that I just showed you showed that incremental change that we've been trying to implement is never going to work. So what is it that would change that situation? What is it that would represent what I call transformative change? The kind of change that we can make that would really have the effect of lowering that upper line in the previous graph. It's what my friend Alan Atkinson calls pressing the reset button on sustainable development. Now, sustainable development has been based on 2 fundamental assumptions. The first, I think, is still valid. That significant changes are needed to safeguard the future and to prevent calamitous loss or collapse in critical environmental and social systems. But the other assumption that we've always made is that these changes can be implemented within the present market-based economy, and that it can be done in a way that will be profitable to the private sector investors. And it's that second one that I think we need to revise. And what I want to do is to give you 4 examples of the kind of transformative change that I think that we need and that we need to put in place. Trade, we talk a lot about trade. Trade is responsible for a very significant part of the economic growth that we've seen since the Second World War. It's currently operating at a level of roughly $40 trillion a year. So this is a massive force. It's a massive influence on society and on our planet. But we have to ask ourselves, if trade is a powerful motor, what is it pulling and where is it taking us? You know, the principles of the trading system are good. You know, it's a level playing field. The rules are equal for everybody, so that all traders operate by the same rules in the same game. But a Tanzanian minister once said that if I get into the ring with Mike Tyson, it's very little consolation that the rules are the same for both of us. What we actually find is that there's an enormous unfairness built into the system. So we have a trading system that keeps things equal. It keeps the powerful countries powerful, keeps the rich countries rich, and it keeps the poor countries poor. There's a negotiation going on right now, and one of the contentious issues in that is the issue of cotton. The United States gives an average subsidy of $100,000 a year to its cotton farmers, to each cotton farmer. The result of that is that they are essentially undermining the livelihoods of several African countries that depend on producing and selling cotton. And Yet, these negotiations go absolutely nowhere. For political reasons, the US wants to maintain those subsidies. And the African countries simply feel that they're being left out, that they're being taken for a ride, that they're being treated incredibly unfairly. And this whole perception of unfairness is leading to the entire trade negotiations being stalled. You look at trade policy as it is now, and you'll find that it's always based on the notion that trade policy has to defend national interests. And I agree with that. If the United States is developing its trade policy, it has to figure out what its interests are and how its trade policy can defend those interests. The problem lies in the fact that those interests are extremely narrowly cast. So that in Switzerland, the country where I live, Swiss trade policy is very strong on defending intellectual property rights because so much of Switzerland's income comes from the pharmaceutical industry or the chemical industry. They're very strong on defending farm subsidies because they have a very uncompetitive form of agriculture which would likely disappear if those subsidies were eliminated. And so you say, well, okay, Swiss trade policy is defending those interests. But if you cast it wider and say, it is in Switzerland's interest to create vibrant markets in the developing world so that we can continue selling our products. Or to say that one of the real fears, one of the real political fears in Switzerland, as in this country, as in this state, is the growth of illegal immigration. You could say, it would make sense for Switzerland to have a trade policy that allowed these countries from which the immigrants come to provide reasonable livelihoods for their people. So it's a real interest of Switzerland's future to limit illegal immigration. Why is that not reflected in its trade policy? So we have trade policy cast in extremely narrow terms. One of the trade minister from Zambia a few years ago said, you know, it's very simple. If we can't export our products, we have no choice but to export ourselves. And that's what we're seeing in the world today. Another example. We have current patterns of trade promoting a form of development that eliminates jobs. Is that necessary? Do we need to increase trade in ways that eliminate jobs? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We could favor forms of trade that were job creating. We could give advantages to the type of trade that creates rather than destroys jobs. So what we have here is a major part of the world economy, $40 trillion worth of trade, an economic activity that is responsible for much of the growth that we've seen in this world since World War II. And the World Trade Organization actually has sustainable development as one of its objectives. If you read the preamble to the WTO, the agreements that created the World Trade Organization, you'll find that the purpose of trade and the purpose of liberalizing trade is to contribute to sustainable development. But what we have instead is forms of trade that are undermining countries, that remain patently unfair, and that do not create jobs, they destroy jobs, and lead to social situations and development situations that create a whole series of other problems that were not intended. So if we were to say, let's take trade policy and harness it to sustainable development, you have an incredibly powerful engine that will pull the economy over into the sustainability space. Same is true of subsidies. Everybody talks about subsidies. They're probably not a very good use of public funds. We know that a lot of subsidies are going to people who really don't deserve them. A lot of the subsidies that we see actually don't go to the intended people. What I think people don't realize is that subsidies are a use of public money to undermine sustainable development. So we are actually taking our tax dollars and using them to undermine sustainable development. It's absolutely crazy. We did a study a while back that showed that using very conservative calculations, that the extent of subsidies in these four areas, agriculture, water, energy, and transport, was roughly $1 trillion a year. And that the great majority of that was providing economic economic incentives for unsustainable behavior. So we are using sums that are absolutely colossal. In agriculture alone, subsidies amount to about $355 billion a year. This is nearly $1 billion a day. And if you look at fossil fuel subsidies, we're subsidizing coal and oil and natural gas and even peat. And the rate of subsidies is probably about twice as much as agriculture. We are using almost $2 billion a day to provide an inducement for people to use carbon-based fuels over the alternative. In other words, here we are worried about climate change, knowing that the solution to climate change comes from weaning ourselves off of a dependence on carbon-based fuels and developing the alternatives. There are many alternatives, there's not a single one, but we need to get onto those alternatives as quickly as possible. And yet, we have our governments spending a fortune in tax money, inducing you to prefer carbon-based fuels over the others. Indonesia, in 2007, had to admit that 40% of its national budget was going into subsidizing transport fuel for the middle class, because the poor actually don't own vehicles. And that what they were spending on transport fuel subsidies, not on all subsidies, on transport fuel subsidies, was more than the entire national investment in health, education, and infrastructure development. So you had subsidies totally undermining the prospects for the future. Now, people will tell you that, well, subsidies, yeah, they're a problem, but they're almost impossible to deal with. You can't reform them. I don't think that's true. And I think that if we do, we can release a colossal amount of money and at the same time remove inducements to unsustainable behavior. I mean, we have lots of examples now of how subsidy reform can actually work. How you can get rid of subsidies if you publish this information. The subsidies that we're talking about, $1 trillion in these 4 areas, I don't know if you realize how much money that is, but it's something like 8 times the amount of money that the UN has calculated it needs to fully implement all of the Millennium Development Goals. 10 times that much. We've talked about bringing development aid up to 0.7. That was a goal set in the early 1970s and never achieved. What we're spending on subsidies would do it 12 times over every year. The most expensive plan ever done was the one in Rio, Agenda 21. Agenda 21, the calculations were it would cost $125 billion a year to implement it fully. 8 times as much we are spending as inducements to behave in the contrary way. And this is our tax money. This is our governments choosing to spend this money in this way. You imagine the leverage that's available in subsidy reform, how by focusing on subsidies, by reforming subsidies, by bringing some sense into this, we can release the kind of investment money that's needed to achieve sustainable development. Here's another, sustainable public procurement. What that means is inducing the public sector to use its procurement money in a way that sends signals to the market that we want sustainable products. Public procurement is 23% of the total global market. We don't realize this because we don't see it all that clearly. But even in the rich countries, it's 15% of all markets. And that's 15% of some very, very large markets. In the developing countries, it can be up to 47% of the entire market. Now, what you're trying to do with sustainable public procurement is to take the government markets and dedicate those to the purchase of sustainable products. So if government should decide that they are going to buy only certified wood wood products from FSC or other sources, or sustainably fished fishery products, or other certified products. This takes the markets to the tipping point. It's always been said that, for example, if you set a new fuel standard and it's adopted by California, Michigan, New York, New England, and Canada, then that becomes the standard for the entire country, because it doesn't make any sense for the automobile industry to continue building vehicles that don't meet that standard. So with all of these things, there's a tipping point at which the entire market flows over to the other side. The advantage of focusing on sustainable public procurement is that this can be done by government decision. We all think that consumers should buy fair trade coffee. We all think that they should buy certified timber. But changing individual consumer behavior is a really difficult thing. But what's the excuse for governments not doing it? What's the excuse where all it takes is a decision that they're going to go that way, and all the effects would follow? China is the world's largest consumer of timber. It's the world's largest importer of timber. Imagine that China would say one day that as of 2012, 30% of the timber we buy has to be certified. And by 2020, 50%, and by 2030, all of it. That single decision would totally transform the way that forestry is conducted around the world. It simply would not be viable not to produce wood in a sustainable way. And that decision is within the hands of a country like China or a country like the United States. These are things that could really shift markets radically over towards the sustainability direction. The last example I'll give you is the world of investment. And we like to say in our investment work that actually sustainable development is an investment challenge. That we are producing and consuming things in a certain way now, and for sustainability we need to move that over to a different place. We need to transform our technology. We need to transform the way we produce and consume energy, and that will require investment. So in a sense, sustainable development can be looked at as an investment challenge. And I'll give you just the example of energy. Sustainable development, or a solution to climate change, will require an absolutely massive shift in the way we use materials and energy. The International Energy Agency in Paris has calculated that in order to stabilize atmospheric carbon at the IPCC target of 450 parts per million, we would need an investment in energy development, energy distribution of $44 trillion over the business as usual scenario. Now, it's extremely unlikely that that kind of money will be raised. But this is the dimension of the challenge. We need to bring massive funding into energy investment so that we can transform the way in which we use energy. And when you think about it, the average energy project has a lifetime of about 35 years. If you're investing in an energy generation plant, you're expecting to recover your investment over a period of about 35 years. So the decisions we take now, the decisions we are taking these days, will determine the pattern of energy use over the next 35 years. Coincidentally, that is roughly the window that we believe we still have available to combat climate change and avoid catastrophic climate change. So the decisions we're taking today on investment will determine whether or not we get there. If we invest in clean energy, if we invest in low carbon production, and we do that on a massive scale, we will probably be able to solve the problem before it reaches the negative tipping point. But if we go on with a kind of business as usual scenario and start sinking huge sums of money into the kind of energy project that will compound the problem, then very likely we won't be able to take advantage of that window, and we'll find ourselves with the worst case scenario. So you have to ask yourself, to make that difference, what does it take? Why isn't investment flowing into clean energy? It's not that hard to work out what it is. It's poor domestic energy policy. It's energy monopolies. It's bad energy pricing. It's laws that restrict investment. All of these things are subject to change. We can deal with them. And sustainability means that we have to start focusing on that kind of thing rather than measuring the rate at which our world is going down the hill. So those are 4 examples that I mean and I meant to be positive examples. We have big problems. Things aren't necessarily going the right way. But we have leverage points here that can make a massive difference. And my view is that if we start focusing the creativity and the energy and the mobilizing power of the sustainable development community on shifting these policy frameworks so that they provide incentives for sustainable development, then I think that we can begin making a difference on a very massive scale. So let me conclude with a few thoughts. The first one seems fairly obvious, but it isn't. We have a system right now that, as I said before, is rewarding unsustainable behavior. I firmly believe that we will only really begin to advance towards sustainable development when we have a policy framework in place that aligns personal interest or corporate interest with sustainable behavior and that punishes the alternatives. So if we have, we'll never get there if we have, on the one hand, the moral argument that, listen, we need to move in this direction, but all the economic rewards to be had from moving the opposite direction. That's where we are now in far too many cases. But if sustainable behavior was aligned with what works well economically, with what rewards enterprise, then we have a very, very powerful argument. I think we also need to, I often say that the challenge of sustainability is the challenge of getting our government systems off a short-term focus and onto a longer-term focus. And I think that we need to ensure that political accountability mechanisms focus on the medium and long term. That we cannot continue to accept that our governments take short-term decisions that might be politically popular, but that are disastrous in the long term. The good news, I think, is that the solutions are broadly known. The technology is broadly available to make the transition to sustainable development. And if you release the sorts of money that's being misused in the subsidy area and apply it to sustainable development, there's actually massive resources available in the economy. It's not that we don't have the money, we do have the money, and we're spending it badly. Nick Stern, Lord Stern, in his famous report on climate change, made a calculation of how much it would cost to get to 450 parts per million. And he estimated that it would be roughly 1% of world GDP. But we're spending almost that much on subsidies, on energy subsidies. So we simply took what we're misspending, providing an inducement for people to overuse carbon fuels, and put it into climate change action. It's a shift, a transfer of money. It shouldn't be beyond human ingenuity to bring that about. And finally, the sustainability crisis. When you look at the social and environmental consequences of poor economic policy, of the results of the economic collapse we've seen in this country and so many others, that should provide us all the motivation that we need to get to start designing a very, very different approach. So I want to close on a quote from an Italian writer called Giuseppe Tommaso di Lampedusa, who wrote a book called The Leopard. And he said something that sounds glib, but I think is actually very profound. If we want everything to stay the same, then everything must change. If we want the kind of world that we grew up in, the kind of world that we love, the kind of planet, the kind of society that we've known and want to continue to live in, In other words, if we want everything to stay the same, then everything is going to have to change. Thanks.